Hi, my name is Jake Vossenkemper, Director of Agronomy and Research here at Liqui-Grow. So welcome to our 2024 Mid-Season Lead Academy update. And today we have a really special guest with us, Phil Long. Phil, I'm going to go ahead and let you introduce yourself a little bit.
Thanks, Jake. Yeah, so Phil Long, I'm a new regional agronomist for North Central Iowa, covering the Hampton and Trayer and Clear Lake locations. I live right in that area, farm on the side a little bit as well, but yeah, just really looking forward to being part of the team and helping out with agronomy and research and bringing that all together for our team.
Absolutely, Phil, and I'll be really honest with you. I've been very impressed with your knowledge base, Phil, and I'm super excited to have you on the team. I know that we've already been collaborating on a lot of research that we need to do to help our customers and future customers. So, Phil, let's talk a little bit about what's happening out there right now. Okay. So I know we were kind of discussing before this. We've been looking up some kind of GDU information and weather history, and so kind of here in eastern Iowa, we're running about 140 GDUs above the 30-year normal, which would equate to roughly 4 to 5 days ahead of normal. And you can probably see some of this tasseling corn behind us. I've been talking to some folks the last couple of days, and they're surprised to see tassel so early. Well, that's why we're running a little bit ahead of schedule, but not so much that we should be concerned about this crop finishing too early. Okay.
Yeah.
What about North Central Iowa?
Yeah, I mean, in the ample moisture, which we'll talk about for sure. We're in the same boat. We're probably a little bit less than that. We're about 90 to 100 GDUs ahead of schedule, so a couple days ahead of normal, and obviously well above normal in terms of rainfall. I was looking at some of those numbers the other day, and we had about 13 inches of rain for the season last year. I mean, the last couple of years have been pretty tough, but we're well past 13 inches already in the season for 2024. So ample moisture, as you can see when you drive up our direction, which we'll talk about a lot of that stuff. But yeah, for sure, things look good. We're there planted on time, and definitely been some good sunny, hot days.
Yeah, absolutely. So Phil, so we'll talk a little bit about the crop conditions. So here in eastern Iowa, things look really good. We planted really timely. We were a little wet early. In parts of eastern Iowa, we've been a little too wet in May. But overall, we've got a really good crop here, both corn and soybean. We've had a couple periods of rather warm weather, but for the most part, we've been about normal when it comes to temperatures. You can see we're tasseling here behind us. This crop is going to experience excellent conditions for seed set in corn and soybean, frankly. So got a lot of good yield potential here in eastern Iowa.
Yeah, I don't know how much time you want me to take, but ours is going to be a little more challenging than that for sure. It's crazy how different it can be not that far away. Yeah, I'd say in general we have a lot of good looking crops that were planted early. We had a pretty good window there in early April that a lot of farmers took advantage of. I would say up to about the 20th of April. And then we had a couple week stretch of a lot of wet weather. And honestly cool. May was fairly cool in general. So we had a lot of ponding, a lot of saturated soils, a lot of delayed planting. Soybeans, you can tell, unfortunately, and the soybeans in terms of the number of fields that didn't get a pre-down. So a lot of fields that have water hemp that are way taller than we'd like to see. That's just how tight the schedule was. As the farmers had to choose whether to wait or if they're spraying their own, whether to just get the crop in and come back. And in a lot of cases, it didn't get done. So it was just a very tight schedule to get that all in. So there's a lot of issues. I've seen a lot of side hills where people got stuck, a lot of side hills where crops didn't come up. We had seedling diseases and so forth. Taking care of those, just saturated conditions. Nothing like we've seen the last couple of years. So I've tried to give it a positive spin, but it's really good that we've got a recharge of the groundwater, about a full recharge in 2 months from what we had the last 3 years, but it's caused a lot of challenging conditions right now. So we have a lot of uneven crop, but where the crop was planted on time and there's not ponding, I would say it looks excellent as well.
Good. All right, so let's touch a little bit more on the challenges. Okay, so definitely in your geography, your whole geography, you've had too much water, right? And so too much water can cause lots of issues, but one of the biggest issues is it can cause a nitrogen loss, both denitrification and leaching.
Yep.
And even in this geography, as you get in part, Iowa City north of Tipton, even in my geography, there's been too much rain in places. And if you watch us often, about a month ago or so, I had a Lead Academy session addressing those concerns, basically stating that, depending on when you applied your nitrogen, you could be experiencing a lot of N loss. And if you were in an area where you had more than 10 or so inches of rain this spring, you should definitely consider side dressing. Now, I did see a lot of side dress rigs out there. I know by talking with Hub and Scott that we've done a lot of side dressing in your geography. So if you didn't do that and you're now noticing a lot of N deficiency out in your crop, I would advise you walk out there and look at the crop. Are you seeing the classic N deficiency symptoms in the lower canopy? Does your entire field or parts of your field have a light kind of lime green hue? If that's the case, I've done a bunch of research work, asking the question, can you save a crop at around BT by supplemental applications? And the answer is yes, you can recuperate some of the yield you would have lost if you did nothing. So even if you waited, some of these figures from that research will be on your screen here. So even if you waited, I would highly recommend trying to save a crop that is clearly inefficient, even at this point. Would it have been better if you addressed it earlier? Yes. But I still believe, based on the work that I've done, it's not too late.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing I'd add to that, too, is the amount of nitrogen that it's taken up is what you're talking about and why it's still worth saving. I mean, I was out in some of the research plots we have there in our area there in Hampton, and seeing some nitrogen deficiencies show up on the low nitrogen treatments. I mean, 0, 40, and even some of the 80-pound treatments, which surprised me. They may not be used to seeing nitrogen deficiency on a crop, this size, but, just remember that yellowing, that V towards the inside, coming up the midrib of the leaf, that's what it is. It's nitrogen deficiency. So, it's hard. Everybody's crops at a different stage, but when I was seeing that, it was around V6, V8, which is only 15, 20% of the total nitrogen uptake. I mean, when they're growing fast like this, they're really taking up a lot of nitrogen, but by tassel, it's about 60% roughly total nitrogen uptake. So there's a lot still to go, and that's why you're saying you can definitely still save the crop. And we got time. Thankfully nowadays we got lots of options, to still get in the crop with a lot of high clearance rates.
All right, so Phil, we talked a lot about the weather we've experienced. Now, what about the forecast, right? And the forecast is always a little bit dicey because it seems like there was a 40% chance of rain yesterday, and I got 2 inches. So, I mean, you don't.
We're agronomists, not meteorologists, thankfully.
Right. You don't quite know, but all we can do is go on what we do know, right? And so, the 30-day forecast by NOAA suggests that we're basically, in my area, your area, going to stay in this same pattern. So the NOAA forecast for the next 30 days suggests that we're going to continue in this wet trend, okay? And we're going to have about normal temperatures, okay? That's what the 30-day forecast shows. If you look at the longer term forecast, so July, August, September, it looks like we're expecting near normal rainfall and maybe slightly warmer than normal temperatures. So apparently NOAA believes that this wet pattern might break at some point, okay? But in the near future, I would expect continued rounds of wet weather. I think you experienced the same weather I did, but last Friday, or maybe it was Thursday, we had an all-day rain event roll through here. Last night, I had 2 inches at my house. It was another widespread rain event. And, all these rain events are definitely probably going to spur some foliar disease in corn and soybean. But why don't you talk a little bit about what those diseases look like, Phil?
Sure.
That we should be concerned about.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what everybody's fearing right now is the continuation of this weather pattern that's really going to spur this on. I mean, we've had the events you're talking about, and I even early on, actually, really early in the season when the corn was just coming up, we had some severe wind events, which really, in some cases, I noticed the way it came across the fields just took that residue and just just really shattered up that corn. I mean, at this tall, you know, really small stage. So it's any of these wind events, and you'll notice that when you look up diseases, the causal factors, you know, splashing, hard rains, wind, anything to open the plant up to an infection, you know, just like as a human, you know, if you get a cut, you're more liable to get other infections in your body. So, yeah, I think all these hard rain events that we've been getting and continued with keeping this moisture up in the canopy. Now that we got strong canopy out there, that moisture is going to stay there, that humidity is going to stay there, and then, you know, it really amplifies the disease potential. So, you know, the ones that come to mind, top of mind for me, probably the common ones, the gray leaf spot. And some of these, you know, gray leaf spot, northern corn leaf blight, you know, so we see them every year, but it just depends on how much of this kind of condition that we get, and we're really setting up for the perfect ideal conditions that they could explode. I will say the caveat before I talk about them is make sure you understand what hybrid you planted, because there is, you know, each hybrid has different, you know, resistance built into it, you know, or bred into it, I should say. So, you know, if you're spraying a fungicide on something that's really tolerant to northern corn leaf blight, that's where you may not see the,
Sure,
you know, the ROI.
absolutely.
So just remember that. That's part of all these factors play together. But yeah, so gray leaf spot at an early stage, you know, gray leaf spot, the one you always want to think it stays kind of in between the veins. Really early stages, it's kind of hard to tell, but as it gets bigger, those lesions, those necrotic lesions are going to expand. They will move out to more veins, but they usually stay between a vein, and then they, you know, slowly coalesce and get bigger. But from an early stage, they're really small. They can look like a lot of different things we were just talking earlier. But gray leaf spot stays in between the veins. That's probably the distinguishment, especially when it comes to northern corn leaf blight, which is going to look like that cigar-shaped lesion, especially if you see it as it's kind of full bloom. You know, it's going to be a cigar-shaped lesion on the leaf, and they can also coalesce and get bigger too, just depending how bad, you know, the conditions are and how much they progressed. That's why scouting is key. You know, you got to make sure you're out there looking at these things, because, you know, especially the one we're going to talk about here shortly, tar spot, you need to be ahead of these diseases. And in a year where we're seeing plenty of moisture, we know it's probably coming. So getting out there and then figuring out what you have and what the conditions are is really important. So, you know, some of the other ones that we want to mention too, if it turns off in more drier fashion, would be the rusts. Especially southern rust, which comes up from the south, can be devastating in some cases. Do you want to go into more detail on what the differences between those look like?
Yeah. So as Phil was suggesting, you know, the common rust is more of a red rust. It's kind of a deep red. It's got some raised sporulation, pustules and structures on it. You can physically feel with your fingers. You can typically see it through the backside of the leaf, and typically, you know, typically common rust is more cosmetic than yield limiting, almost always. I mean, I've never seen, in my 15 years professionally doing this, I've never seen common rust where I was concerned it was reducing yields, but you see it a lot, right? There's a few lesions here and there in almost every field. Okay. Southern rust, though, is more of an orangish rust. It typically doesn't have any large raised structures to it. Typically, you can shake it off on your hand and you'll physically see a rusty material on your hand. Now, it's not super common here, but when we have it, it can be very yield limiting. So it blows up from the south. So if we have it, especially if we have a hurricane or a big wind event that comes from the south, it can really push southern rust up here. And given that it's a 1 in 10 year issue, the hybrids just don't have any genetic resistance to it. So when we get it, it can be very yield limiting. And that's one that scouting could be super helpful, because let's say you've made a fungicide application. If you find out, you know, by you know, early dent, you've got southern rust, you probably need to take action and spray another round of fungicide. So not super common, but one that if you do have, you need to be able to quickly identify and address. So yeah, that would kind of wrap up the important corn diseases. Every once in a while, you'll see something called eye spot. I saw some out here. You see it in a lot of cases, but it's a white kind of halo-looking thing. It's just like common rust. It's in a lot of places, but never gets too bad.
Yeah, and we didn't talk much about tar spot yet, but it kind of goes along with a little bit in the rust category in terms of how prolific it can quickly become a problem in the field. You know, it doesn't come up the same way, but the problem is a lot of fields, especially I'd say in all of our neck of the woods, the inoculum's already there. So we have it. We've seen it in past harvests. You know, as you're running the combine, you've seen that tar spot, those lesions on the leaf, those black spots that you can't rub off. You know, it just looks like tar, like somebody splattered it with a brush and tar. You can't brush those off, and so the inoculum's there. Once that's there, then basically we just need the right conditions. But we were talking earlier about how quickly it infects and before we even see it. So before you're even seeing visual, you know, symptoms on the leaf, it's probably been in there for at least 14 days.
Yeah.
So that's why it can spread so quickly. So back to the scouting part, if you see it, you need to be out there. I mean, if it's showing up, you need to be out there looking at it regularly, daily. If you know, probably daily, depending on the conditions, to determine a time to spray. Because just like Jake was saying, that timing is critical. You know, and all the way up even through dent. You know, there's a lot of yield there, and as good as we're setting up right now, we don't want to lose a lot of that photosynthetic area of the leaf. So protecting it all the way through that grain fill period is really critical.
Absolutely, Phil. And again, you and I were talking about this before we shot this, but you know, you have been up in north central Iowa for a couple of years now, and you have seen it come in late to some extent almost every year. But it's been so late that it wasn't yield limiting in general, right? And I would mirror that here. And so we've been dealing with it 5, 6, 7 years here in eastern Iowa now, and it seems like no matter what, it comes in. You know, whether it's dry, whether it's moist or whatever, we have some level of it. The question is, how early does it show up and how bad does it get? And, you know, my little bit of evidence suggests that when we're wet and when we have wet conditions, that's when it really takes off. But like last year, it was in every field almost, but it never really got to, you know, an epidemic level at all, right? But with the way the weather's showing, you know, with the way the weather has been and is predicted to be for the next month, all bets are suggesting that it could get severe. And, you know, not trying to alarm anyone, but, you know, I have physically observed in part of our geography very, very significant yield losses in the tune of 50 to 100 bushel. 100 bushel is the extreme case, but that definitely can happen. So it can turn what was going to be a reasonably productive crop and hopefully a profitable crop into a crop that is definitely not profitable. So it's definitely something that we need to keep our eye on. And if things start to get bad, you know, we can do another session perhaps where we talk about what we're seeing and what's happening. All right, Phil, so we've talked a lot about, you know, the future weather now, and we've established that, you know, the way things are shaping up, it could be a significant year for foliar diseases in both corn and soybeans. Yep. All right, so now let's talk about kind of best management practices when it comes to using a fungicide. All right, so if you're going to spray, you know, based on scouting, you need to apply a fungicide in corn, you know, the moment you start seeing diseases. Okay. If you're just going to apply a fungicide, the best time to just apply a fungicide is right at BT. So some of the old school recommendations were, you know, wait until R2. You know, we're concerned about aborting years, and not that we still shouldn't be somewhat concerned about that, but you know, if you're using a fungicide that's labeled for BT applications, you should be good to go at BT. And I might add, be careful about putting everything under the sun in with that fungicide, particularly if you're going at BT or before, because there can be some problems associated with some of those other products that you add to the fungicide.
Yeah, okay. That's where I've seen most of the issues is before that VT timing. I think in general that VT timing is like you said, spot on, perfect timing. When you're hitting that V15 area, then you need to pay attention to, and it tells you right on the labels of those surfactants and products that they shouldn't be mixed in at that point. So just be cautious about that. It can cause issues with ear development and so forth. But yeah. So why not spray at V5? We kind of missed that. I know there's some fields around us that actually still aren't quite to V5. So maybe V5 would be a good time for them.
Yeah, that's a great question, Phil. So it seems like more and more there's a lot more V5, V6 fungicide applications going on. And I'm not quite sure why exactly, because I'm not aware of any independent data that suggests that that's a reasonably profitable practice. And so I've talked about this before, but I'll talk about it again. You know, there was a big university study where lots of folks kind of put data together, and they found that roughly 5 to 15% of the time a V5, V6 fungicide application was profitable in corn. Okay, and every once in a while you might pick up a bad anthracnose epidemic, or maybe, you know, a foliar disease came on much earlier than normal, but it just isn't that common for that application to be profitable. So if you're going to spend money on fungicide, which in a lot of cases is warranted, it ought to be during reproductive growth. And if you're not going to scout, BT should be when you apply that. Now, with tar spot and the way this year's setting up, you know, it's possible in some cases two applications during reproductive growth might be warranted. But I have not seen any data that suggests a V5, V6 application is something that's going to be routinely profitable.
Yeah, I'd agree with that too. I think in general, I have seen some anthracnose out in the corn-on-corn fields there this year, but I would tend to say make sure you watch that for late season, because it's the same pathogen that's going to be a crown rot issue. So, you know, standability at the end of the season is probably more of an issue than the foliar side of it at V5. So.
Yep. So what about soybeans? What's the time we need to apply fungicides in soybeans, Phil?
Yeah, so it's on the soybean side of things, I would say if outside of scouting, obviously, and white mold's a little bit of an outlier here, but as far as the rest of the diseases that are potential issues, that R3 time frame is typically the best time frame to hit it. I'm not going to say R3 without telling you what R3 is, because it's tough to identify. You know, we have indeterminate beans;
Absolutely.
They keep growing. You know, so once we get to reproduction past R2, we look at the top 4 nodes. And on the top 4 nodes, basically you're looking for, it's basically once the flower is done, but it's a 3/16 roughly size pod, so very small. That's going to be your R3 or beginning pod. And then you go to R4, which is full pod, so then you got a pod that's basically like an inch or so on the top 4. So remember, top 4 nodes is what you're looking for, and being out there more than just once every 3 weeks, you're not going to catch it at that point. You got to get an understanding that you may go out this week and the next week it looks like it went backwards. That's just because beans keep growing, keep flowering, keep putting on nodes.
That's exactly right, Phil. And practically speaking, you know, in the 9 years I've been here at Liqui-Grow now, I get lots of pictures from farmers and retail salesmen and say, hey, are these beans at R3? Now, based on that photo, I'm not sure it was taken, but based on that photo, these beans are well into R4. You know, so it can get away from you because it's those little bitty pods you're looking for. So R3 can get away from you real quick, and there's quite a bit of data that suggests if you're just going to apply a fungicide, R3 is the time to do it. You can lose yield, you know, if it's too early or too late. So R3 is a pretty important time in soybean.
Yeah, and I mentioned white mold, which is an outlier, but I'd also say that you know, things like frog eye leaf spot, which can be bad. The one reason I think a frog eye is bad, especially like I said, going back to varieties, you know, you should know your variety's tolerance to it, but frog eye really starts at the top of the canopy and moves down. Most of our other diseases like brown spot come up from the bottom, which the leaves are senescing down there anyway below the canopy if it's canopied. So, you know, frog eye can be an issue if we have the right conditions. That's one that can spread fairly rapidly.
And
so
it's sort of like the conditions we're experiencing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's the urgency for all this, I feel like, is it seems like we're setting up for ideal conditions. So yeah, that one I'd say, you know, there's a lot. I think we're going to see quite a bit, especially in our area of brown stem rot, FDS, just early season, you know, root rot kind of diseases, because we had, you know, lots of maybe not so good at decisions on tillage and so forth, and wet conditions, wet soils, ponded, saturated soils, compaction, and so forth, setting us up for some of those things on the back end of this season. But
and I know you know this, Phil, but just making sure the viewers know this: sudden death syndrome and brown spot or brown stem rot cannot be treated with a foliar fungicide.
Yes.
Okay. Yep. And yeah.
Correct.
Just making sure people understand that.
Yeah.
But definitely frog eye leaf spot, definitely brown spot. Usually the mildews, the downy mildews don't get too bad, but that's another one that can definitely be treated with the fungicide.
Since you mentioned it, I'll also throw in there the bacterial stuff, because sometimes people think that's an issue, and obviously you're not going to cure much with a fungicide on a bacteria. So,
Sure.
you know, we have bacteria pustule and I'm spacing the other one here, but there's two bacterial ones that can kind of look like, the one looks like tearing on the leaf, and then bacterial pustule. So, yeah, those things you got to know the disease, because you don't want to be spraying something that's not going to, you know, like we talked about with fungicides. So.
All right, so let's wrap the soybean thing up, Phil. So I've talked about this a lot in the past, but you know, I believe personally that a fungicide and insecticide application can be a reasonably profitable practice in soybean, in particular in soybean. And you know, it definitely depends on the year, right? So, you know, when we have a wet July and August, there's no question that a fungicide insecticide application is most likely going to pay. Okay, and that's what we're setting up for. But even in a year where it's not super moist, you can still see a reasonably consistent yield increase from a fungicide. Doesn't always pay when we don't have moisture, you know, not always, but you tend to see a yield increase from a combination of a fungicide and insecticide application. I've got several different studies here that they'll flip through on the screen where you can look at those. One of them's a big university study done all across the Midwest. I think in that paper they reported an average yield increase of 4.6 bushel. A bunch of data I put together from companies that don't sell fungicides suggests 4.1 bushel with the combination of an insecticide and fungicide on average. And then finally, there was another study I had in there, but I can't recall off the cuff which one that was. But I think that wraps up the soybean fungicide application.
Yeah, I might just add a little bit more to that, and I think, you know, the part of the insecticide, you know, part of that equation, from what I've seen in the past, is going back to how soybeans kind of remobilize their nutrients into the seed at the end of the year. They need that area, that leaf area, we need to protect that, and that's why if you ever look at those injury levels and so forth, especially on the insect side, you'll notice that early reproduction, you know, it's a lot more. You can withstand a lot more damage because they're still growing and putting on leaf area. But later, as we get into seed fill, it's more like 20%. If you're seeing 20%, you know, leaf loss or leaf area damage, you need to be paying attention and potentially putting on something like insecticide. Because if there's diseases out there, and then you have Japanese beetles and bean leaf beetles coming back, and all these other insects, you know, feeding. A lot of times we get grasshoppers and everything else, depending on the year. There's a lot of things putting pressure on the beans, aborting, you know, seeds one at a time, and then losing that leaf loss. So
and it all adds up.
It all adds up. Yeah, what I'm trying to say. So it definitely makes a difference having that in there for soybeans.
All right, so Phil, let's wrap this up. Let's give our customers and potential customers kind of our key takeaways from this growing season so far. We've had a lot of wet weather, particularly in your geography, and that weather has caused, you know, the major issue. There's been lots of in-loss in places. Okay, if that was not addressed, and you are seeing nitrogen deficiency on your field, and/or you're seeing yellow holes, my previous research suggests that a rescue application can definitely be profitable. Okay. What we know today about foliar diseases are we've had the weather conditions. The near-term forecast suggests that we'll continue to have those conditions, and we're setting up for a significant disease year in both corn and soybean. Last year, we were asking the question, are we going to have a crop? Because it was so dry. And we didn't end up having a lot of foliar diseases. We did in places, but in general, we had a lower level of foliar diseases because we were so dry. That's definitely not the case this year. Okay. And then I think you wanted to share a couple things about updates in the future.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, you know, keep in mind that disease triangle we talk about a lot. So the environment, we've talked a lot about the environment. That plays a big role in it. So we both think that we're going to see a lot of that going forward, and so it's really going to pay off in terms of fungicide. But if that goes away, maybe it does turn off really dry, maybe things change. We'll hope for that, but in the meantime, you know, Dr. Jake and I will both be making sure that we provide updates if we see something like tar spot, because it's highly variable depending on our location. So we'll be making sure that we do updates throughout the remainder of the season, and especially in the near term. So keep it tuned to our channel here. Make sure to like and subscribe, and thanks again for watching this Lead Academy session.
Thank you.
Lead Academy.
Liqui-Grow.
Excellent
science
and agronomy
development.